Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things we have to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, if you have hubcaps, go ahead and remove those. Next, we're going to remove all 4 of our 21mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Alright, now that we have the wheel off of there, the next thing that we want to pay attention to is the jam nut. The jam nut is what's located in between your outer tie rod end and your inner tie rod end. This is a 19mm, but I'm just going to use some nice long pliers because it's easier for me. Now let's move along to removing our outer tie rod end nut right here. To do that, I'm going to use a 14mm socket with an extension. Now I'm just going to put the nut back on there a couple threads. A little bit of penetrant. The next thing we're going to do is start separating the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. I have the nut on here as a safety nut. I'm going to continue on with my hammer. I'm going to give the knuckle a couple loving bonks to try to break this free. Now we can start removing our outer tie rod end from the inner tie rod end. To do that, I'm going to turn this counterclockwise, and each turn I'm going to make sure I count it and write that down. 2, 3, and so on. The next thing that we need to do is remove this jam nut from the inner tie rod end. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and hold the inner tie rod end with some locking pliers, and then I'll use my 19mm socket to remove the nut. Now we can move along to removing our bellows boot. To do that, you're going to have an outer clamp and an inner clamp. The outer clamp you can simply grab with some long nose pliers. We'll squeeze all the ears and remove the clamp itself. Now we're going to remove the inner clamp. Now for this one, it's just a single time use. You essentially just break it right off. So I'm going to rest my bar on it, give it a loving bonk, see if I can break it off. Remove that clamp. All right, once you have all your clamps off, we can go ahead and grab onto that bellows boot. We're going to give it a couple twists and remove it from the power steering rack. Now it's time to start unscrewing the inner tie rod end from our power steering rack. If you're working on the passenger side inner tie rod end, go ahead and turn your steering wheel all the way to the left. That's going to push this out farthest to you so it's easier to access. After that, you're going to want an inner tie rod end tool. There's lots of different ones. You could even use some long pliers if you had to. Once you have it broken free, go ahead and remove your tool. Unscrew your inner tie rod end and remove it from the power steering rack. You'll notice at the far end here, I put a tiny bit of blue thread locker on there. Blue's okay to use, red's not what you should use. Let's go ahead and put this in. We're just going to bottom it out and then we'll snug it up. Make sure that's nice and snug. Remove your tool. Alright, now inside your inner tie rod end package, you probably noticed that you had a little package of grease. This grease is super important. You want to make sure that you go ahead and layer a whole bunch of it inside this ball and socket area. Work it in there. Save a little bit inside that package for the next step. Once you have that packed, let's go ahead and take a little bit of that grease and we're going to come right up along this groove that you can see on the inner tie rod end. This essentially is where the boot's going to sit, so you want to make sure that you have some lubricant there. That's going to help out the alignment professional in the end. Okay, now it's time to put on the bellows boot. Let's go ahead and take a wire tie. We're just going to go ahead and start this right along this inner portion right here. We'll keep it nice and loose for now. There we are. Now we can slide the bellows boot up and onto the power steering rack all the way on the inner portion there. Slide that right up on there. So you just want to double check to make sure that the boot's completely situated on the power steering rack. You don't want to leave an area for any dirt or debris or moisture or anything else to make its way in. After that, you can go ahead and tighten up your wire tie. Just give it a couple twists here with the pliers. Trim off the excess. Once you have the inner portion on, let's go ahead and come out to this outer portion right there. We'll just line that up with the groove on the inner tie rod end. We can put on the outer clamp. Get that right onto position there. Snug it up. Make sure it's nice and tight. Now let's apply some copper never seize to the threaded area, put on our jam nut. Now we can get ready to install our outer tie rod end. Let's go ahead and start this on. Once it's started, count the amount of turns that it takes to put it on so it matches up with the same amount of turns as it took to remove it. Now we can take that outer tie rod end, we'll line it up with the hole in the knuckle, slide it up in there. We can put on that outer tie rod end nut. We'll bottom this out. Now we can snug this up and then torque this to 25 foot-pounds. Let's bottom out this jam nut with the outer tie rod end. Once it's bottomed out, just go ahead and make sure it's nice and snug. Now the next thing that we're going to want to do is pay attention to the outer tie rod end in comparison to the knuckle itself. You want to make sure that they're pretty much as level as possible. If they're not, just go ahead and grab some pliers, grab onto that outer tie rod end, give it a little twist until it's as close as possible. Okay, so now at this point we can go ahead and put our wheel back up on here. Let's start on all of our lug nuts. We'll bottom these out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we're going to torque the lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds. Now that we have the wheels safely on the ground, let's go ahead and torque these in a crisscross manner. After you have all your lug nuts safely torqued, let's go ahead and put on our hubcap. Now for this, you're going to have a valve cover hole. You want to make sure that you line this up with the stem. Give it a couple loving bonks, make sure it's completely secured so it doesn't fall off while you're driving down the road. Okay friends, we got the front end back together. What's left to do now? Now you're going to want to make sure that you take your car safely for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks.